The call had come just after midnight, a sharp, insistent chirp that dragged me from a tangle of half-formed dreams. My name, User Who, was spoken with an urgency that left no room for pleasantries. A high-profile case, an emergency autopsy requested, and the location, the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. I'd heard those words enough times to know it meant a rush job, likely with political pressure simmering just beneath the surface. I arrived in the pre-dawn gloom, the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and something metallic, a scent that always clung to places where lives ended abruptly. The basement corridor was a stark, uninviting tunnel, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with a weary drone. My boots echoed on the linoleum, a solitary rhythm in the otherwise hushed facility. I clutched my forensic kit, the familiar weight a small comfort against the prickle of unease that always preceded a new case. The lead detective, a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights and tough decisions, met me at the entrance to the preparation area. He didn't waste time on small talk. User Who, glad you could make it. This one's a mess but straightforward. His voice was gravelly, tired. Victor Thorne, you know the name? I nodded. Victor Thorne, the tech mogul, the philanthropist, the man whose face graced the covers of business magazines and whose political endorsements carried serious weight. His sudden demise had already dominated the morning news cycles, even before I'd stepped out of my apartment. Found in his penthouse office, classic scene, the detective continued, pushing through the double doors. Entry forced, safe cracked, contents gone, Thorne himself. Well, he put up a fight. Stab wound to the chest, defensive wounds on his arms. Looks like a robbery gone sideways. We've got a couple of persons of interest already known for this kind of work. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested room was cold, the air conditioned to preserve. The body of Victor Thorne lay on the stainless steel table, covered by a sheet. Even beneath the sterile linen, the sheer presence of the man was undeniable. He'd been a formidable figure in life. Death had merely stilled his power, not erased it. My role was clear. Forensic analysis of trace evidence, a meticulous search for anything the initial responders might have missed in their haste to confirm the obvious crime. Everyone was convinced. A botched robbery, a desperate thief, a tragic end for a titan of industry. The media was already writing the story. My job was to dot the I's and cross the T's. The pathologist, a quiet, efficient individual with hands that moved with practiced precision, peeled back the sheet. The site was precisely as described. A man in his late 50s, well-preserved but now terribly, irrevocably broken. The single, deep stab wound to the left side of his chest was stark against his pale skin. His hands, even in death, seemed to clench, scarred with the telltale nicks and abrasions of a struggle. The event, the fatal confrontation, was laid bare. I donned my gloves and respirator, the sterile air now smelling faintly of antiseptic and something deeper, more primal. My eyes, trained to see beyond the obvious, began their slow, methodical sweep. I started with Thorne's hands, documenting each defensive wound, each broken nail. Beneath one fingernail, a sliver of what looked like dark fabric, standard. I collected it carefully, placing it into a sterile evidence bag. Then I moved to his clothing, still partially intact on the gurney beside him, having been carefully removed by the attendants. A high-end suit, now torn and stained. I picked up the jacket, turning it over slowly, examining the precise nature of the rips, the faint dustings of particulate matter. This was where the real story often hid. The surface narrative was for headlines. The truth was in the fibers, the dust, the microscopic remnants of a violent interaction. The pathologist continued his internal examination, dictating his findings to a recording device. Entry point consistent with a single-edged blade, approximately 5 inches in length. Trajectory consistent with an upward thrust. Significant blood loss. All perfectly aligned with the robbery theory. My fingers traced the lapel of Thorne's jacket. I felt a slight roughness. I leaned closer, pulling out my magnifying loupe. The fabric was a fine merino wool, but there, just a fraction of an inch from a small tear, was a cluster of tiny, almost imperceptible fibers. They were synthetic, a startlingly bright, almost electric blue, and they weren't wool. I blinked, adjusting the loop, my brow furrowing. Electric blue. It was such a vibrant, almost unnatural shade, and it seemed out of place. Thorne's suit was charcoal. This blue was anything but. I scraped a few of the fibers into a micro vial, labeling it meticulously. This was the reveal, a tiny, almost insignificant detail that snagged at my forensic brain. It was a fragment of something alien to the scene, something that didn't quite fit the picture of a simple, desperate robbery. I paused, my gaze drifting back to Thorne's unseeing face. Had he really struggled with someone wearing something so distinctive? Or was this a transfer from something else entirely? A moment of doubt crept in. Was I overthinking it? It was a single, tiny cluster, easily explained away as contamination from an EMT's uniform, perhaps, or even a stray fiber from the ambulance gurney. I'd seen stranger things, but the color, it was so loud, it demanded attention. It felt like a discordant note in an otherwise perfectly orchestrated symphony of violence. Everyone else saw a clear-cut case. I saw a vibrant, electric blue thread dangling, threatening to unravel the whole thing. "Anything interesting, user who?" the detective asked, his voice pulling me back from my microscopic focus. I straightened up, turning the vial in my gloved hand. "Just some anomalous fibers, collecting them for analysis." I kept my tone neutral, giving nothing away, but the question was there, unasked, unvoiced. What if this wasn't what it seemed? The tension in the room was palpable, a silent hum of expectation for me to confirm what they already believed. And I, user who, had just found a reason to doubt it all. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested room was cold, the air conditioned to preserve. He'd been a formidable figure in life, a titan of industry whose name echoed in boardrooms and whispered in political circles. Now he was just a case, my case. I pulled on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves, the material stretching taut over my fingers. The air, despite its chill, carried that faint, metallic tang I'd grown accustomed to. It wasn't the smell of decay, not yet, but the raw scent of finality. The detective, a burly figure with a perpetually furrowed brow, stood in the doorway, a clipboard clutched like a shield. He hadn't bothered to don protective gear. He just watched, his impatience a palpable weight in the room. "Open and shut, user who," he grunted, his voice a low rumble. "A robbery gone bad. The official scene report is clear. Entry wound, defensive wounds, struggle. The usual." I nodded, not looking up. "The usual," I echoed, my voice softer, almost lost in the hum of the ventilation system. I preferred to let the evidence speak, not the initial assumptions. Assumptions were the enemy of truth, the quickest route to overlooking the crucial detail. With a practiced movement, I peeled back the sheet. Victor Thorne's face was slack, the usual intensity gone, replaced by the pallor of death. His eyes, fixed and distant, held no secrets I could decipher. Not yet, anyway. The official report cited a single gunshot wound to the chest as the cause of death, sustained during a violent home invasion. Simple, clean, too clean sometimes. I began my external examination, my eyes scanning every inch of his form. The man was still dressed in what appeared to be expensive loungewear, now stained and torn. There were indeed signs of a struggle, abraded knuckles, a tear in his shirt sleeve, scuff marks on his expensive leather slippers, all consistent with the narrative. My fingers, light and precise, traced the contours of his skin, searching for anything anomalous. I always started broad, then narrowed my focus. His hands were particularly telling. The abraded knuckles suggested he'd thrown a punch or two. I meticulously collected samples, bagging and labeling them. Routine, expected. Then I moved to his feet. The scuff marks on the slippers were consistent with dragging or shuffling. But as I carefully removed the left slipper, something caught my eye. It was almost imperceptible, lodged deep in the intricate pattern of the sole, partially obscured by a thin film of dried mud and dust. I leaned closer, my magnifier to my eye. This one was incredibly fine, almost translucent with a subtle, iridescent sheen. It was a synthetic material, no doubt, but one I didn't immediately recognize as common household textile or outdoor debris. It had a faint, almost metallic gleam when the overhead lights hit it just right. My brow furrowed. The official scene report described the Thorne residence as a sprawling estate with manicured lawns and marble floors. No industrial carpeting, no specialized synthetic materials were mentioned in the preliminary walkthroughs. And this fiber, this almost ethereal wisp, didn't look like anything that would naturally adhere to a shoe from walking across a marble floor or a pristine lawn. It certainly didn't look like mud or dust. "Find anything interesting, user who?" the detective asked, his voice breaking my concentration. He was still by the door, tapping his clipboard with a pen. "Just collecting the usual," I replied, carefully extracting the fiber with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers. Easy to miss, easy to dismiss. But its placement deep in the sole of the slipper suggested it had been there for some time, perhaps even before the reported struggle. Or, at the very least, it hadn't been picked up from the immediate vicinity of the robbery gone bad. I placed the fiber into a sterile evidence bag, sealing it with a practiced hand. My mind began to race, piecing together fragments. If Thorne had been involved in a violent struggle in his home, how would such a specific, non-residential fiber get lodged so deeply in his slipper before or during the event? It didn't fit. Not perfectly. A tiny, almost insignificant detail, yet it nagged at me. It was a dissonant note in an otherwise harmonious, albeit tragic, symphony. The official narrative painted a picture of a random, brutal encounter, but this fiber, this single, peculiar thread, suggested a different prelude. It hinted at a prior engagement, a visit to an unexpected location, or an encounter with an unknown material. I looked at Thorne's face again. The placid expression seemed to mock the violence described in the reports. Was it possible the struggle wasn't what it seemed? Was it possible the scene had been carefully constructed, and this tiny fiber was a piece of debris left behind from the real events leading up to his death? It was just a fiber. It could be contamination. It could be from anywhere. My own mind, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize it away. But the precise location, the unusual material, the way it seemed to defy the simple explanation, it wouldn't let go. I finished my initial external scan, moving on to the more intrusive elements of the examination. But that fiber, sealed away in its tiny bag, had already planted a seed. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my gut, that I wouldn't be able to ignore it. The chilled air of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested bit at my exposed skin the moment I stepped through the heavy, reinforced door. It wasn't the sterile, clinical cold I was used to in my lab. This was a damp, almost earthy chill, a constant reminder of the concrete shell around us. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, insistent buzz, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the stainless steel surfaces. The smell was a familiar, unwelcome blend of disinfectant, stale blood, and something metallic, like old pennies. The senior pathologist, a man whose hands always seemed to move with a practiced, almost bored efficiency, was already gloved and gowned, hovering over the gurney. He gave me a brief, non-committal nod, his eyes already focused on the still form beneath the sheet. "User who? Glad I could make it. They're pushing for quick turnaround on this one. Open and shut, they say." "So I hear," I replied, pulling on my own set of gloves. I didn't need to be told. The whole atmosphere screamed expedite. Thorne's murder had generated enough noise that everyone wanted it filed away, neatly packaged. But that fiber in his slipper still snagged at my thoughts, a loose thread in an otherwise tightly woven narrative. The pathologist pulled back the sheet. Thorne, or what was left of him, lay exposed. The official report described a violent home invasion, a struggle, and a fatal blow. My eyes, however, went straight to his hands. Expected defensive wounds were present, abrasions and contusions across the knuckles, some deeper cuts on the palms, standard fare for someone fighting for their life. But something about the nature of the grime under his fingernails pricked at me. This was finer, almost particulate with a faint, unusual sheen. Cause of death appears consistent with the initial report. The pathologist droned, beginning his external examination. Blunt force trauma to the head, several blows. Looks like a struggle ensued before the fatal injury. Classic defensive wounds on the forearms, hands. He pointed to a particularly nasty gash on Thorne's left forearm, already discolored. Consistent with a sharp object, perhaps a broken piece of furniture or a shard of glass from the reported struggle. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on Thorne's right hand. The pathologist had moved on, discussing the trajectory of the blows, but I was stuck on that grime. I took a small, sterile swab and carefully scraped beneath two of Thorne's fingernails, bagging the samples. The pathologist barely registered my action, accustomed to my meticulousness. "What do I make of these?" I asked, holding up the bagged swabs. The material under his nails, it's unusual, not what I'd expect from a domestic environment. The pathologist glanced at the tiny samples, then back at the body. "Looks like dirt, user who he was fighting. Probably fell, scraped his hands on something. We'll send it for analysis, of course, but I doubt it's anything significant. The primary focus is the trauma." His tone was polite but dismissive. He was already mentally ticking off boxes, but it wasn't just dirt. I knew dirt. This was different. It had a faint, almost metallic aroma that was entirely out of place. And then I saw it in even more peculiar detail. On the inside of Thorne's right wrist, just above the line of a defensive abrasion, was a faint, almost invisible residue. It looked like a smudge, barely there, a ghost of something left behind. It was a pale, almost silvery gray, contrasting subtly with the dead skin. I pulled a magnifying glass from my kit and leaned in. The smudge wasn't uniform. It had a distinct, almost fibrous texture like compressed powder. It wasn't paint, wasn't dust, and certainly wasn't blood. And it wasn't mentioned in any preliminary report. It was too small, too easily overlooked by anyone not specifically looking for anomalies. "Hold on," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This mark here." I pointed with a gloved finger. "On the wrist, have I logged this?" The pathologist paused, straightened up, and peered over my shoulder. He squinted. Looks like a minor abrasion, perhaps. Easily missed given the other trauma. Could be anything. Contact with a surface during the struggle." He tried to brush it off, literally. The gloved finger, but I stopped him. "No, don't. It's not an abrasion. It's a transfer, a residue." My mind raced. The industrial fiber from his slipper. The strange particulate under his nails, now this. It was too much to be coincidence. It has a distinct texture, almost crystalline but pliable. I took a set of micro tweezers and a sterile slide, carefully scraping a minuscule amount of the residue onto the glass. It was barely visible to the naked eye, faint silvery dust. I held it up. The pathologist sighed, a sound of mild exasperation. "User who, we have a clear cause of death, multiple witnesses placing the victim at the scene of the struggle and a known assailant, though currently at large. We're not looking for alien dust." He tried to lighten the mood with a weak joke, but I didn't smile. "This looks like nothing more than incidental contact." I read, overthinking it. Overthinking it. My internal voice bristled. "Or you're underthinking it." The official narrative was a brick wall, solid and unyielding, but I was seeing cracks, small hairline fractures, but cracks nonetheless. "I'm just doing my job," I stated, my voice even though my pulse had quickened. "Every detail matters." This residue, combined with the fiber from his slipper and the material under his nails, paints a different picture than a simple domestic struggle. He just stared at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, annoyance, impatience, before he turned back to the larger, more obvious wounds. "We'll include my samples in the submission, but I stand by my preliminary findings. Let's not invent complications where none exist." I bagged the slide, sealing it with a fresh label. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent battle of wills. He wanted simplicity. I was finding complexity. As the pathologist continued his methodical work, detailing the gruesome injuries that aligned perfectly with the official story, I felt a familiar prickle of doubt. Was I just seeing patterns where none existed? Was my mind so accustomed to digging for the hidden truth that I was creating it? The senior pathologist, after all, had decades of experience. He'd seen thousands of bodies, thousands of crime scenes. Who was I to question his immediate assessment? But then I remembered the fiber, so deeply embedded in Thorne's slipper, and the peculiar sheen of the particulate, and now this silvery residue. It wasn't just one thing. It was three, all pointing away from the neat, tidy explanation. No, I wasn't imagining things. Something was profoundly wrong with the official narrative, and I was holding the first pieces of proof in my gloved hands. I just had to figure out what they meant and how they fit together. And I had a sinking feeling that nobody else wanted me to. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung heavy and cold, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sterile bite of disinfectants. The lead detective, a man whose patience seemed to thin with every passing minute, had just gestured for the pathologist to conclude. And the pathologist, true to form, was delivering precisely what the detective wanted to hear. A straightforward, unvarnished account of blunt force trauma, consistent with the initial findings, aligning perfectly with the narrative of a robbery gone wrong. Multiple contusions, extensive cranial fracturing, consistent with repeated blows from a heavy, blunt object. The pathologist recited, his voice monotone, precise. He pointed with a gloved hand to a particularly gruesome injury on the victim's temple. The trajectory and impact force suggest a struggle, but ultimately overwhelming force. I stood a little apart, my gaze fixed on the body, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the earlier moments. The detective's impatience was a constant hum in the room, a pressure for simplicity. He wanted a clean case, a perp, a conviction. And for everyone else here, the pathologist's meticulous recital of injuries, while grim, painted that picture clearly, an open and shut case. But I had that microscopic slide in my bag, sealed and labeled. The one with the anomaly. A tiny, almost insignificant detail, yet it had snagged my attention like a burr on a wool sweater. My fingers twitched, almost wanting to pull it out again, to hold it up to the harsh fluorescent lights and demand someone else see what I saw. But I knew better. Not here, not now. The pathologist droned on, detailing abrasions, defensive wounds, all perfectly fitting the violent struggle scenario. I forced myself to listen, to absorb every detail, even the ones that felt extraneous to my own nascent unease. My job was to connect dots, even if those dots seemed to belong to different puzzles. Time of death estimated between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the pathologist concluded, wiping his hands on a fresh towel. No further anomalies to report that would alter the primary cause or manner of death. No further anomalies. My internal voice scoffed. He hadn't looked for them. He wasn't trained to see them at that level. The lead detective nodded, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. Good, we'll get the report filed, thanks. He turned to leave, his presence a dark wave receding from the autopsy table. I stayed, a silent fixture. The pathologist glanced at me, a question in his eyes. He knew I lingered for more than just the official report. "I still thinking about that particulate?" he asked, his voice low enough not to carry to the retreating detective. I nodded, pulling a small, sterile container from my kit. "I'd like a sample from under the fingernails, and a comprehensive toxicology panel. Standard procedure, I know, but I want to be thorough." He sighed but didn't argue. "Fine. Just don't hold us up, user who. This case is moving fast." "Just doing my job," I replied, my voice steady, though a tremor of frustration ran beneath it. Back in my own laboratory, the sterile silence was a welcome change from the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. I carefully placed the new samples under my microscope, running the toxicology tests, but my mind kept circling back to the original anomaly. The tiny, almost crystalline fleck I'd found embedded in a superficial wound on the victim's forearm. It wasn't skin, wasn't fiber, wasn't dirt from the crime scene. It was something else entirely, something manufactured. I pulled out the sealed slide from my bag, slotting it into my microscope. The fleck glowed under the magnification, irregular, almost metallic, but with an organic-looking striation. I cross-referenced it with every database I had: industrial dust, mineral composites, even unusual pollen structures. Nothing. It was unique, or at least uniquely unfamiliar to my vast library of known particles. Frustration pricked at me. What was it? And why was it there? The crime scene, a dilapidated apartment in a low-income district, was hardly a manufacturing plant. I leaned back, rubbing my temples. My eyes drifted to the monitor displaying the initial crime scene photos. The apartment was a mess, deliberately so, consistent with the robbery gone wrong theory. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out, cheap electronics missing. But as I scrolled through, something else caught my eye. Something I'd dismissed as background clutter before. A small ceramic figurine shattered on the floor near the victim. It wasn't valuable, just a trinket painted with a faded pastoral scene. But one shard, glinting under the flash of the crime scene photographer's camera, looked off. It wasn't the smooth, glazed surface of ceramic. It had a rough, almost granular texture. Wait, that doesn't add up. My internal alarm bells began to clang. I zoomed in, pixelating the image, but I could still make it out. That texture. It looked almost identical to the striations I'd seen on the fleck under my microscope. I pulled up the incident report from the lead detective. Victim, redacted, found deceased in apartment. Apparent robbery, items missing. No mention of anything unusual about the broken figurine. Why would there be? It was just another piece of debris in a ransacked apartment. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a piece of the puzzle deliberately overlooked? I remembered the interview transcripts. A neighbor, a woman who claimed to have heard a commotion but didn't see anything specific. Another, who spoke of strange lights a few nights before, dismissed as irrelevant by the investigating officers. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The fleck on the victim's arm. The strange texture of the broken figurine. The fact that the apartment was in a low-income area, yet the fleck suggested an industrial, perhaps even specialized, environment. The reveal hit me with the force of a physical blow. What if the figurine wasn't ceramic at all? What if it was disguised? What if that strange, almost crystalline fleck was a fragment of a much larger, more complex composite material, designed to look like cheap ceramic? And if so, why? Why put a disguised object in a rundown apartment? My theory began to coalesce, complex and unsettling. The apartment wasn't just a crime scene, it was a stage. The robbery a distraction. The victim possibly not the intended target of a simple mugging, but someone involved in something far more intricate. The fleck then wasn't just a random particle. It was a signature, a trace from where this disguised object, or perhaps the victim themselves, had truly been. The tension in my chest tightened. I was seeing a hidden connection, a thread weaving through disparate elements, tying them together into a narrative that utterly contradicted the official story. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was deliberate, orchestrated. There was I seeing patterns where none existed, desperate to find complexity in what everyone else considered straightforward. The lead detective would laugh me out of the room. The pathologist would shake his head, but the fleck, the figurine, and I, user who, was the only one listening. I had to know what that fleck truly was, where it came from. And if I was right, this simple robbery case was about to become very, very dangerous. My determination hardened. I had a new, more complex theory, and I would follow it no matter how much resistance I faced. My internal alarm bells began to clang. That texture. Victim, redacted, found deceased, blunt force trauma. Cause of death consistent with fall. No signs of struggle. Scene secured. No signs of struggle. My gut clenched. The fleck I'd meticulously extracted from the victim's clothing wasn't some random environmental contaminant. It was a composite material, dark gray, with microscopic, parallel gouges, striations so fine they suggested a high-speed impact or abrasion against a specific, hardened surface. And here, in the photo accompanying the detective's report, a wide shot of the entry corridor was a distinct, shallow gouge on the polished steel doorframe, right at hip height. The angle, the depth, even the subtle, almost iridescent sheen of the displaced metal around the mark. It was a near-perfect match for the impact signature I'd theorized could have created the fleck. This wasn't a fall. This was a forced interaction, a violent scraping. Someone had been pressed against that doorframe hard, and whatever they were wearing or carrying had left a trace. And that trace was now sitting in my lab, tiny but screaming. I spent another hour cross-referencing, enhancing, comparing. The more I looked, the more certain I became. The fleck wasn't just similar to the doorframe mark. It was a fragment from the object that caused the doorframe mark. And that object, by extension, was likely involved in the blunt force trauma. This wasn't an open and shut case of a fall. It was something else entirely. A sharp buzz from my desk phone startled me. It was the administrative assistant. User who, the lead detective, requests your presence immediately. Down in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. They want you there for a briefing. My stomach did a nervous flip. A briefing. On my findings, this was it then. My chance to present the anomaly. I carefully secured the fleck, printed out my comparative images, and compiled my notes. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was a place I usually avoided unless absolutely necessary. It had a peculiar clinical chill that seeped into my bones, and a faint, metallic scent that no amount of ventilation seemed to dissipate. The air was thick with a quiet gravity, the unspoken presence of what had been, and what was to come. The lead detective stood by one of the tables, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on a monitor displaying a schematic of the victim's internal injuries. Beside him was a superior, a stern-faced individual whose reputation for upholding protocol preceded them. Neither looked particularly pleased to see me. User who, the detective said, his voice flat, not a hint of warmth. Thanks for coming down, we're wrapping up here. I nodded, clutching my folder a little tighter. Sir, I have some findings regarding the material evidence from the scene. Oh, the superior interjected, raising an eyebrow. I thought this was a clear-cut case. An accidental fall, yes. That's what the initial assessment concluded, yes. I clarified, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. However, I believe the forensic evidence suggests otherwise. The fleck recovered from the victim's clothing, a composite material, shows striations consistent with high-force abrasion. I've cross-referenced it with a specific gouge on the steel doorframe in the incident photo. The unique micro-texture of the fleck and the mark on the frame are highly correlative. It indicates a struggle or at least a forceful contact that doesn't align with an accidental fall. I opened my folder, sliding the printouts across the stainless steel table. The detective barely glanced at them. The superior leaned in slightly, then straightened up, a dismissive sigh escaping them. User who, the detective began, his tone now edged with impatience. We appreciate your diligence, but we have a complete picture here. The victim was elderly, prone to dizziness. The medical examiner's initial assessment supports blunt force trauma consistent with a fall onto a hard surface. The gouge you're referring to could be anything, wear and tear, an old scuff. You're seeing patterns where there aren't any, son. But the fleck, I started, trying to push my point. The fleck is likely circumstantial. The superior cut in, their voice laced with finality. Environmental debris happens all the time. Your analysis, while thorough, is deviating from the established facts. This case is closed. We're not looking for complications. My breath caught in my throat. Closed. There's a backlog of minor incidents in the lab. We'll assign you to those. My throat felt tight, dry. I stared at the printouts, then at the two figures, their faces unyielding. They hadn't even truly looked at what I'd presented. They'd already made up their minds. The dismissal hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolute. Had I overinterpreted? Was I chasing ghosts? But no, the images were clear. The fleck was unique. The striations were specific. My internal certainty warred with their dismissive authority. I gathered my papers, my movements stiff. Understood, sirs. I walked out of that hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, feeling a profound sense of isolation. My usual collaborators, a couple of junior analysts, were suddenly busy, avoiding eye contact. A colleague, usually chatty, offered only a curt nod as I passed. The lead detective's message, clear and unyielding, had already permeated the unspoken ranks. I was out of line. I was a problem. The weight of their dismissal pressed down on me, threatening to crush the spark of conviction. Am I wrong? I questioned myself, staring at the magnified image of the fleck on my screen. Am I really just seeing things? But then I zoomed in again, tracing the minute parallel lines, the distinct pattern of impact. No, my eyes weren't deceiving me. This wasn't environmental debris. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a clue, undeniable and screaming, even if no one else wanted to hear it. They wanted me to drop it. They wanted me to fall in line. But the thought of letting this go, of ignoring what my own hands had uncovered, felt like a betrayal, not just of the truth, but of myself. A fierce, quiet determination solidified within me. If they wouldn't listen, if they wouldn't investigate, then I would. Alone. The case might be closed for them, but for me it was just beginning. I pushed my chair back, the squeak echoing in the sudden quiet of the lab. It was time to find another way. That distinct pattern, those minute parallel lines etched into the fabric of the scene, they wouldn't leave me alone. I'd stared at the magnified images until my eyes burned, until the lines seemed to float in my vision even when I looked away. It wasn't just a clue. It was a defiant whisper in a room full of shouts, and I was the only one who seemed to hear it. Or rather, the only one willing to listen. My colleagues, the detective leading the investigation, even the lab supervisor, they'd all given me that look. The one that said, "User who, don't rock the boat. It's an open and shut. Move on." But I couldn't. My gut, that annoying, insistent part of me that had always been right about the small things, was screaming. The next morning, the air in my small lab cubicle felt thick, heavier than usual. I'd barely slept, replaying the images, sketching the patterns on a notepad. I knew I had to push. I started drafting an official request for a re-examination, focusing on the specific area where I'd found the anomaly. I was halfway through when my desk phone buzzed, a private line I rarely used. I picked it up. A low, distorted voice, like static trying to form words, grunted, "Some things are best left buried, user who." Then a click and the line went dead. My hand tightened around the receiver. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a threat, not overtly, more like a suggestion, a dark, chilling suggestion. Who knew? How did they know I was even looking at something beyond the official report? My heart thumped a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Had someone been watching my screen, my movements? It felt like the walls themselves were listening. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, maybe a disgruntled colleague. But the timing, right after my discovery, right before I planned to escalate it, it felt too precise to be random. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just about a missed detail anymore. This was about someone actively trying to suppress it. Despite the tremor in my hands, I finished the request, printing it with a decisive snap. I marched it straight to the lab supervisor's office. He read it, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. "User who, we've already signed off on the initial assessment. The pathologist has completed their report," he said, tapping a pen against the page. "An emergency re-autopsy. This is highly unusual." "It's about an anomaly, sir," I insisted, trying to keep my voice steady. "A microscopic detail that, if overlooked, could fundamentally change our understanding of the sequence of events. It requires a direct examination of the source material." He sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "You're convinced this isn't just debris, environmental contamination?" "I'm convinced it warrants a second look, sir, from the source." I met his gaze, refusing to back down. He studied me for a long moment, then picked up his phone. A few terse words later, he hung up. "Fine," he relented, "but you go with it. You explain your findings to the pathologist yourself." Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the polished concrete floor. The air was thick with the faint metallic scent I associated with these environments. A heavy steel door marked with biohazard symbols stood at the far end of the corridor. I followed the attendant, a burly individual with tired eyes, through a series of increasingly narrow passages until we reached the examination room. Inside, the pathologist, a stocky woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper wit, was already there, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. He looked at me, a hint of impatience in his expression. "User who," he stated, his voice brisk. "I understand I have some concerns about my initial findings." He gestured to the stainless steel table where the subject of our discussion lay, covered by a white sheet. "Let's be quick. My schedule is tight." My heart hammered, a mix of apprehension and adrenaline. I took a deep breath. My apologies for the inconvenience. My analysis of the transferred material indicates a highly specific pattern of impact that wasn't consistent with the initial assessment of environmental debris. I believe it warrants a direct visual inspection of the entry point. She raised an eyebrow, a skeptical glint in her eyes. "I think I missed something. User who, I've been doing this for 20 years. With all due respect," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes the smallest details require a fresh perspective. The material I examined was microscopic. I'm suggesting we look for a macro-level corroboration." She huffed, but her curiosity, I sensed, was piqued. "All right, show me." She pulled back the sheet, revealing the victim's upper torso. The entry wound was stark, a testament to the violence of the event. I pointed to the edge of the wound where the skin was slightly abraded. "Here, I believe we'll find evidence of the same pattern I observed on the transfer material." The pathologist leaned closer, adjusting her magnification goggles. She used a small, sterile probe, gently tracing the rim of the wound. I held my breath, my gaze fixed on her face, searching for any flicker of recognition. For a long moment, there was nothing but the soft scrape of the probe against skin. Then her eyes narrowed. She repositioned the lamp, angling the light just so. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, almost to herself. She moved a little further down, examining another area near the primary impact. "There's a secondary set of marks here, almost imperceptible, like a glancing blow or something dragged across the surface just after impact." She looked up at me, a new, unsettling glint in her eyes. "Faint, but I read right. It wasn't environmental." She paused, then added, "It looks like a deliberate attempt." That confirmed it. My initial discovery wasn't just an overlooked detail, it was something someone wanted hidden. And the pathologist, with all her experience, had seen it now too. My theory had just gained a powerful ally. We worked for another hour, meticulously documenting the new findings, taking more samples. The pathologist, initially dismissive, was now fully engaged, her skepticism replaced by a grim determination. Leaving the hospital basement, the cold air outside felt like a relief, but the sense of unease lingered. If someone had tried to obscure this evidence, what else had they done? And how far would they go to keep it buried? I drove home, the city lights blurring into streaks. The distorted voice on the phone echoed in my head. "Some things are best left buried." Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence that the pathologist had almost missed these marks and that I'd gotten a warning call. But the feeling, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, told me otherwise. When I finally pulled into my driveway, something felt off. I fumbled for my keys, my senses on high alert. The front door was slightly ajar. I always locked it, always. The living room was undisturbed, but a faint, acrid smell hung in the air. I walked into my lab, my breath catching in my throat. My desk, usually meticulously organized, was a mess. My monitor was smashed, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. Papers were scattered, my microscope knocked onto its side. And on the wall, crudely spray-painted in angry red, were 3 simple words: "Drop IT now." The message was no longer a suggestion. It was a declaration of war. My earlier doubt evaporated, replaced by a searing certainty. I wasn't just looking at a cover-up. I was in the middle of it. and someone knew I was getting too close. The air in my small apartment felt heavy, thick with the unsaid threat that had ended my previous night. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer. Every creak of the old building's timbers sounded like a footstep. I'd barely slept, the cryptic message replaying in my mind, a chilling whisper of confirmation. And worse, someone high up, someone dangerous, knew I was tugging at the threads. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, the cheap caffeine doing little to cut through the exhaustion or the gnawing anxiety when my phone buzzed. The caller ID flashed a number I recognized from the precinct, but it wasn't the lead detective. It was a colleague from the forensic department, someone usually reserved for less dramatic assignments. User who, the voice on the other end was tight, strained. They're asking for you specifically. Urgent. Another one. My grip tightened on the mug. Another one. Where? They're calling it an emergency autopsy requested. At the hospital basement. They want you there pronto. Said something about unusual circumstances and a priority flag. The words hit me like a physical blow. Hospital basement. The implication, the sheer speed of it, sent a shiver down my spine. Emergency autopsies were rare, reserved for cases where time was absolutely critical, or where the circumstances were so irregular they couldn't wait for standard protocol. And another one. My mind immediately jumped to the first victim, the anomalies I'd found, the warnings I'd received. The drive across the city felt endless, the early morning traffic a blur of indifferent faces. My thoughts raced, connecting the dots I hadn't dared to connect fully before. If this was related, if there was a second victim, it meant my findings weren't just anomalies. They were a pattern, and a pattern meant a killer, or worse, killers, with an agenda far more complex than a random act of violence. The hospital basement was a maze of dimly lit corridors, the air thick with the faint, sterile tang of disinfectant mixed with something metallic and vaguely sweet. This wasn't the usual, purpose-built facility I was accustomed to. It felt temporary, makeshift. I navigated through a series of service tunnels, following hastily scrawled signs until I reached a heavy, unmarked door. A uniformed officer, looking pale and ill at ease, nodded me through. Inside, the scene was grim. The room was smaller than a typical examination suite, its tiled walls stark under the harsh fluorescent lights. A single stainless steel table dominated the space, and on it, shrouded by a sheet, lay the reason for my urgent summons. The lead detective, his face etched with exhaustion, stood beside the table talking quietly with a couple of his investigators. He looked up as I entered, his gaze heavy. "User who, thanks for getting here so fast," he said, his voice low. "Another one, he was found this morning, same district as the first. We've got a lot of questions." I nodded, my eyes already drawn to the shrouded form, my gut clenched. This was it, the link, the corroboration, the confirmation of everything I'd feared. The detective stepped aside, a silent invitation. I approached the table, my breath catching in my throat. I pulled back the sheet. The second victim was a woman younger than the first, perhaps in her late 20s. My gaze swept over her, taking in the usual external indicators, lividity, rigor, signs of struggle. But my forensic eye was searching for something specific, something that would either confirm my worst suspicions or send me back to square one. And then I saw it. Almost imperceptibly, tucked just beneath the hairline at the nape of her neck, was a faint discoloration. It was small, no bigger than a thumbnail, a subtle purplish red mark that could easily be dismissed as a minor bruise, a birthmark, or even post-mortem artifact. But I knew better. I leaned closer, my magnifying glass pressed against the skin. The edges were too sharp, too defined, almost geometric. It wasn't a bruise. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for my kit. I took a series of macro photographs, documenting the anomaly from every angle. This mark, this imprint, was identical to the one I'd found on the first victim, the one that had been dismissed as irrelevant, the one that had prompted my anonymous warning. "User who, everything all right?" The detective asked, observing my focused intensity. I straightened up, trying to keep my voice level, to project a professional calm I didn't feel. Just making a detailed record of some specific external findings, detective. Always best to be thorough. I paused, then added carefully, "Did your initial crime scene report mention anything unusual around the victim's neck or head?" He frowned, thinking, "Not particularly. Some minor abrasions consistent with a struggle, but nothing that jumped out." "Why, you see something?" "Possibly," I replied, my gaze flicking to the discreet mark again. "It's very subtle, could be nothing, could be something." I couldn't tell him everything, not yet. Not without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, or worse, drawing more unwanted attention to myself. I needed more than a visual match, I needed undeniable proof. But internally the pieces were clicking into place with terrifying precision. This wasn't random. 2 victims, different demographics, different locations, but with the same obscure, almost invisible mark. It was a signature. The first time it was an oddity. Now, it was a pattern, a deliberate act. Someone was marking their victims, and that someone was connected to the same powerful forces that had warned me off the initial case. My earlier doubt about the validity of my own findings vanished completely, replaced by a renewed, stark certainty. My initial assessment had been correct. The first victim's case was far from open and shut. It was connected, deeply connected. And now, with a second victim bearing the same silent testament, the pattern was clearer, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I was no longer just a forensic analyst examining evidence. I was an accidental witness to a meticulously crafted, horrifying truth. And the message I'd received wasn't just a declaration of war. It was a promise that I was already in the crosshairs. The tension in the room, previously just a byproduct of death, now felt personal, a suffocating shroud wrapped tightly around me. I had to find out what this mark meant before I became the third victim. The subtle mark had burrowed into my thoughts, a tiny, almost invisible splinter of an anomaly. It was so faint, so easy to dismiss, yet it nagged at me. My colleague had seen it too, or at least acknowledged its existence, but the official narrative, the one everyone else seemed to buy into, had no room for such minutiae. Could be nothing, could be something. Those words echoed in my head. I knew deep down it was something. Something significant enough that I couldn't risk revealing my suspicions fully, not when the air around me felt thick with unspoken warnings. The call came in the dead of night, jarring me awake, a rushed, clipped voice on the other end. "User who, we have an emergency." Another one, "They're requesting you specifically. Get to the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. ASAP." My stomach clenched. Another one. The phrase hung heavy. I threw on clothes, grabbed my analysis kit, and was out the door before the full implications settled. The city streets were slick with a fine drizzle, reflecting the neon glow of distant signs like spilled oil. My thoughts raced, connecting the dots I hadn't even fully drawn yet. Was this related? Or was my mind, hyper-alert from the previous case, just looking for patterns where none existed? The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested facility, was a sterile, cold expanse of polished steel and industrial lighting. Unlike the usual examination rooms, this one felt temporary, almost provisional, yet meticulously equipped. The air hummed with the quiet thrum of ventilation systems, carrying the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant. A single examination table dominated the center, under a battery of bright, articulated lamps. The attending forensic technician, a gaunt individual with perpetually tired eyes, merely nodded at me. "Victim found a few hours ago. No ID yet. Apparent overdose, but the detective handling the case insisted on you taking a look. Said something about loose ends." I peeled off my jacket, donned my scrubs, gloves, and mask. The victim on the table was a young adult, slight of build, pale skin against the stark white sheet. My eyes immediately went to the area where I'd found the previous subtle mark on the earlier case. Nothing immediately apparent. My colleague arrived then, looking just as rumpled as I felt. He gave me a questioning glance, then turned his attention to the body. "Overdose, they say," my colleague murmured, pulling on his own gloves. I leaned closer, my magnifiers already in place. "That's the preliminary." I began my methodical sweep, starting with the skin, then moving to the clothing. The official cause of death might be an overdose, but my gut told me to look for the how, not just the what. My fingers, encased in latex, moved with practiced precision, feeling for anything out of place. It was on the inside seam of the victim's t-shirt near the collar. So tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, a single, iridescent thread. It wasn't cotton, wasn't polyester. Under my portable microscope, it shimmered with a subtle, metallic sheen unlike any common fabric I'd ever encountered. It was impossibly fine, almost like spun glass, but flexible. And then, as I adjusted the light, I saw it, a microscopic, almost imperceptible indentation on the victim's skin, directly beneath where the thread had been pressed. It was the same distinct, almost geometric pattern I'd seen before the subtle mark. My breath hitched. "There," I whispered, pointing with a gloved finger. "Look." My colleague leaned in, adjusting his own eyepiece. He was silent for a long moment, then straightened, his brow furrowed. "That's unusual. A foreign fiber, certainly, and that mark. It's identical to the one you were obsessing over on the previous case." "Obsessing is one word for it," I answered, a dry edge to my voice. "But yes, identical." My mind raced. Two seemingly unrelated cases, two different methods of apparent death, but the same unique fiber, the same subtle, almost coded mark. This wasn't coincidence. This was a signature. I carefully collected the fiber, placing it in a sterile sample container. Then I moved to the skin, taking a micro swab of the indentation. This fiber isn't standard, and the mark isn't just a random abrasion. It's too precise. My colleague paced the small perimeter of the room. "So, what are you saying, user who? That someone is staging these deaths, leaving a calling card?" "I'm saying the official narrative is flawed," I corrected, my voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline building inside me. Two different victims, two different scenarios, same obscure forensic signature. This isn't random, it's targeted. I paused, looking from the victim to my colleague. And this fiber, it feels almost engineered. Not natural, not something you'd find in a typical environment. I spent the next hour meticulously documenting every detail, every minute variation in the skin, every foreign particle. The overdose, if it was one, seemed almost secondary to the presence of this peculiar fiber and mark. What kind of organization would use such an obscure, almost imperceptible signature? One that didn't want to be found, but couldn't resist leaving a trace. A trace only someone looking for it would ever spot. Back in my lab the next morning, I ran the fiber through every analytical test I could think of. XRF, SEM, FDR. The results were startling. It was a synthetic polymer, yes, but interwoven with metallic nanoparticles, creating its unique shimmer and strength and the composition. It was proprietary, extremely specialized. My database, vast as it was, only returned a handful of potential matches. All of them pointed to a single, highly secretive advanced materials research and manufacturing conglomerate. A global entity known for its cutting-edge, often classified industrial applications. The consortium. They were practically untouchable, shrouded in layers of corporate secrecy and political influence. Their products range from aerospace components to medical prosthetics, all at the absolute forefront of technology. For this fiber to be linked to them, it meant something far grander, far more dangerous than simple street crime. User who? My colleague's voice, a little too close, made me jump. He was standing in the doorway, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hand. Any breakthroughs? I looked at the glowing screen, the complex molecular structures dancing before my eyes. Breakthroughs, yes. Comforting, no. I turned to him, my voice low. This fiber, it's from a proprietary blend, used by a very specific, very powerful group, the kind of group that doesn't like loose ends. His eyes widened and he set the mug down with a clatter. "You're telling me this isn't just a killer, it's an organization." "A network," I confirmed, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "And they're leaving their mark. Why leave such a unique signature at all, unless it wasn't meant to be found by us, but by them? A confirmation, a warning." The weight of it pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. They was I connecting dots that weren't there, driven by the sheer pressure of it all, by the need to find meaning in senseless death. The thought gnawed at me, a tiny worm of doubt. This was too big, far too big for a forensic analyst to stumble upon alone. But then I looked back at the microscopic image of the fiber glinting under the virtual light, and the distinct geometric mark. It was undeniable, it was real, and if I didn't pursue it, who would? If I backed down now, they would win. The truth would stay buried, and I couldn't let that happen, not after what I'd seen, not after what I'd started to uncover. The sterile chill of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested settled deep in my bones, a stark contrast to the humid night air I just left. The smell of disinfectant, metallic tang, and something else, something sickly sweet and final, clung to everything. This wasn't my usual lab, with its familiar hum of equipment and organized chaos. Here, the fluorescent lights buzzed with an oppressive intensity, casting harsh shadows that danced with every movement of the attending personnel. Another one, user who, the pathologist, a burly individual with perpetually tired eyes, grunted without looking up from the stainless steel table. The sheet-draped form beneath him seemed almost too small, too still. Official report says a fall, drunk probably. He was found him near the docks. A fall, drunk. My gut clenched. That was the easy answer, the convenient narrative, just like the others. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping crisply against my skin, and approached the table. The assistant, a quiet observer, handed me a magnifying lamp. "Mind if I take a preliminary look?" I asked, my voice betraying none of the urgency I felt. The pathologist just waved a dismissive hand, already prepping his instruments. "Be my guest." Nothing much to see, just a lot of blunt force trauma consistent with a tumble down a flight of concrete stairs. I focused on the face first, then the hands. They were calloused, the nails rough, indicative of manual labor. Not the hands of someone who spent their nights in velvet-lined bars. And the man's eyes, though glazed, held a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration around the pupils. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the small glass plate of the lamp. A tiny, iridescent shimmer. Was it just a trick of the light? My mind, already primed for anomalies, wanted to see something. I pushed back the initial doubt. No, this was different. It wasn't just a reflection. Blunt force trauma, yes, I murmured, tracing a finger protected by the glove, of course, along a shallow abrasion on the victim's temple. But what about this? I pointed to a minuscule, almost invisible speck embedded in the wound. It was barely visible, a fleck of something that caught the light with an unnatural sheen, like a fragment of mother of pearl, but too geometric, too perfect. The pathologist squinted. "Looks like concrete dust, or debris from the fall. Happens." Maybe, I conceded, but my internal alarm bells were deafening. Concrete dust didn't shimmer like that, and it certainly didn't have that unique, almost crystalline structure I was starting to perceive. Could I get a swab, and perhaps a micro sample of this particular area? He sighed, a long, suffering sound. "User who, we've got a backlog. This is a clear-cut case." I carefully guided his hand, indicating the exact point. The assistant efficiently collected the samples, labeling them with a practiced hand. I knew I was pushing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. This was the opening. Once the initial examination was complete and the pathologist moved on to the internal organs, I retreated to a small, cluttered side room they used for preliminary tissue analysis. It wasn't my advanced lab, but it had a decent microscope. I mounted the micro sample on a slide, my hand steady despite the tremor in my chest. Under the lens, the speck wasn't just dust. It was an impossibly tiny hexagonal structure, barely a micron across, catching the light with a faint internal luminescence. It wasn't organic, it wasn't concrete, and it wasn't random. It was manufactured. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a signature. The mark I'd theorized about, the one the network was leaving behind. This hexagonal structure, I realized with a jolt, had a familiar resonance with some of the obscure, almost artistic patterns I'd noticed in the backgrounds of old crime scene photos, dismissed as irrelevant debris or photographic artifacts. Now, seeing it embedded, undeniably in human tissue, it clicked into place with terrifying clarity. "Wait, that doesn't add up," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible. If this was a fall, why would such a meticulously crafted synthetic particle be embedded so deeply in the wound? It wasn't something I'd pick up from a concrete step. I spent the next hour, a blur of intense focus, meticulously examining the sample, comparing its refractive index, its crystalline structure, against various known materials from a limited database on the ancient computer terminal. Nothing matched. It was truly unique. Then a thought struck me. The previous victims, the ones deemed accidents or natural causes. I remembered a faint, almost subliminal pattern in the discoloration of their skin, specifically around the primary impact sites or points of entry for whatever truly killed them. Could it be a residue from a delivery mechanism, or the active agent itself? I took a deep breath, the stale air doing little to calm my racing heart. I needed more sophisticated equipment, something that could analyze elemental composition at a nanoscopic level. I needed my lab, but I couldn't just walk out of the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested with these samples, not without raising serious suspicion. I carefully transferred a minute portion of the hexagonal particle onto a specialized, inert slide, sealing it with an almost religious care. This was it, the definitive proof. This wasn't just a trace element, it was a micro-engineered component. Its presence here in the wound of a man supposedly killed by a fall screamed deliberate action. It wasn't a byproduct, it was a tool. The implications were enormous. This tiny, almost invisible structure was the key. It connected this accidental death to the others. It proved the existence of a highly sophisticated, well-funded group capable of deploying such advanced, undetectable methods. It meant the network wasn't just leaving a mark, they were using a signature weapon. A silent, untraceable kill mechanism, leaving behind only this infinitesimal, almost impossible to find proof. My hand trembled as I placed the slide into a secure, padded container. I had it. The undeniable, irrefutable evidence. But getting it out, presenting it, and making anyone believe me against a tide of official narratives felt like climbing a sheer cliff face in a hurricane. The weight of what I held in my hand, the knowledge it represented, felt like a target painted squarely on my back. The game had just changed, and I was holding the winning card, but it was a card that could also get me killed. The low hum of the ventilation system was the only sound that cut through the silence in the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested room. The assistant, his brow furrowed with a mixture of professional diligence and barely concealed irritation, had just finished sealing the last sample vial. I watched him, my breath held tight in my chest. This was it. The tiny, almost invisible fibers I'd pointed out, embedded deep within the deceased's dermal layers, were now contained, labeled, and ready for analysis. "Prioritize these," I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. "Stat, I need results yesterday." The assistant nodded, not meeting my eyes. "I understand, user who, but there are other urgent cases." "Nothing is more urgent than this," I countered, my gaze unwavering. He knew I wasn't asking. He knew the weight behind my words, the unspoken implication that this wasn't just another routine procedure. He collected the rack of vials, his movements precise, and headed towards the adjacent lab section, a series of cramped, older rooms dedicated to specialized analysis. I stayed in the autopsy room, the metallic tang of the air a familiar comfort. My mind raced, replaying every detail of the case, every anomaly I'd painstakingly uncovered. The official narrative was a brick wall, but I felt a hairline fracture forming right where those fibers had been. They were synthetic, almost crystalline in their structure, unlike anything I'd ever encountered in a biological sample. Not clothing, not carpet, not even industrial dust, they felt deliberate. An hour later, which felt like a lifetime, the assistant reappeared, a single microslide clutched in his gloved hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He didn't need to say anything, I knew. "The electron microscope confirmed it," he murmured, his voice hushed. "These aren't natural, not even close end. There's a unique molecular signature, a polymer blend I've never seen." He handed me a printout of the spectroscopic analysis. My eyes scanned the complex graphs, my brain processing the data at an almost frantic pace. He was right. This wasn't just unusual, it was designed. A specific, highly resilient, almost inert material. It wasn't meant to be found. It was meant to be overlooked, absorbed, gone, but I'd found it. "This is the open," I murmured, more to myself than to him. This wasn't an accidental death. This wasn't a fall. This was orchestrated. The fibers were a residue from something specific, something that had come into direct, violent contact with the deceased. A weapon, a restraint, a specific environment. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The entire official report was a lie. I felt exposed, like a spotlight had suddenly glared down on me. I'd walked straight into the heart of something much larger than a single murder case. And now, I was holding the smoking gun. "User who," the assistant said, his voice laced with concern. "What does this mean?" I looked at him, seeing the fear in his eyes. He was a good man, just doing his job. I couldn't drag him deeper into this. "It means we have a lot more work to do," I responded, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Secure these findings. Make 3 copies. One for me, one for my personal off-site storage, and one for the lead investigator. Under no circumstances is this information to be disseminated further without my direct authorization." He nodded, still looking unnerved but following my instructions. I knew I was pushing the boundaries of standard protocol, but standard protocol hadn't accounted for a cover-up this elaborate. As I walked towards the small, communal break room to grab a much-needed coffee, the feeling of being watched intensified. My phone vibrated. It was an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "User who," a clipped, authoritative voice said, not waiting for me to identify myself. "Report to the main processing center immediately. There's been a priority evidence transfer that requires your direct supervision. Your presence is mandatory." "My current assignment here is critical," I replied, a prickle of suspicion rising. "Can't another analyst handle it?" "Negative. It's regarding the original case, the one that's been closed. A procedural audit. Urgent. Drop everything." The line went dead. A procedural audit on a closed case, and my direct supervision. It reeked of a distraction. They knew. They must have known I was close, perhaps even suspected what I'd just found. This was too convenient, too abrupt. My gut screamed at me to ignore the call, to stay put and protect the evidence. But if I defied a direct order, it would be seen as insubordination, giving them an easy way to remove me. I walked back to the lab, my mind racing. The assistant was meticulously bagging the slides and printouts. "I have to go," I told him. "A priority transfer. Don't let anyone access those findings until I return, not even the lead investigator unless I'm present." He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Be careful, user who," he added quietly. I gave him a tight nod. "You too." I locked my personal findings, a backup of the spectroscopic analysis, in a secure, fireproof box I kept in my locker, tucked beneath a pile of old lab coats. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I could do on short notice. Then, I headed for the main processing center, a building several blocks away. The air outside was cool, but I felt a bead of sweat trickle down my temple. When I arrived at the processing center, the security guard at the front desk seemed surprised to see me. "User who, no one informed me you'd be coming in today." "I received an urgent call," I explained, trying to keep my voice even. "A priority evidence transfer, a procedural audit on the closed case." He frowned, checking his logs. "Nothing here, user who. No audit scheduled, no priority transfers. This wasn't a distraction. It was a setup. Are you sure you weren't misinformed?" I stared at the screen, the words blurring before my eyes. "No, I wasn't misinformed. I was lured away. Lured away from the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, from the only place where I could protect the evidence I just uncovered." My mind reeled. They had called me away knowing I would leave the critical new findings vulnerable. But to what end? Just to destroy them or something worse? I need to use a secure line, I told the guard, my voice tight. Immediately. He pointed to a phone in a small, glass-walled office. As I walked towards it, my own phone vibrated again. This time it was a message, an image attachment. I opened it. It was a photo of my lab station back in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. Specifically, a close-up of my personal evidence kit, the one I always carried, now open. And inside it, carefully placed on top of my tools, was a small, ornate silver locket. It was identical to one reported missing from the deceased's personal effects, an item that had been specifically not found at the original scene, adding to the initial confusion of the official report. My breath hitched. They hadn't just lured me away. They had framed me. Framed me for theft, for tampering with evidence, for planting an item that would completely undermine the official narrative and, more importantly, discredit me entirely. They thought they had me, but they had underestimated my determination. This wasn't a dead end. This was a declaration of war, and I wasn't about to surrender. I had to get back to that basement. Now, this was it. I need results yesterday. The low hum vibrated not just through the floor, but through my very bones. It wasn't the distant drone of an HVAC system, nor the rumble of city traffic above. This was closer, more mechanical, more deliberate. It pulsed with a rhythmic, almost predatory quality, growing steadily louder. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising hum. They were here. Not an abstract they, but a tangible threat closing in. My mind, usually a calm archive of data and protocols, raced through escape routes, through defensive maneuvers I'd only ever read about. The corridor I was in was dimly lit, a service tunnel connecting various utility areas. Not a place for a public chase. My eyes darted, searching for an exit, a hiding spot, anything. Then I spotted it, a heavy, grimy metal door, almost camouflaged against the concrete wall, marked with a faded "no entry, maintenance only." It was exactly the kind of overlooked access point I'd learned to spot from years of analyzing facility layouts for security breaches. I lunged, my fingers finding the cold, rusted bar handle. It was stiff, protesting, but with a grunt. I managed to yank it open just enough to squeeze through. The space beyond was a cramped, dusty shaft, smelling faintly of ozone and old wiring. A service elevator shaft, I realized, the kind used for heavy equipment, not people. Perfect. I dropped inside, landing with a soft thud on a thick layer of industrial dust and forgotten debris. The door hissed shut behind me, plunging me into near-total darkness, save for a sliver of light filtering from the crack around the doorframe. The hum outside intensified, then seemed to pass by, fading slightly. They hadn't seen me, not yet. I pressed myself against the cold metal wall of the shaft, listening. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed down the corridor, then stopped. A low murmur of voices, indistinct but definitely human. My breath hitched. They were searching. I could almost picture them, flashlights cutting through the gloom, their eyes scanning for any sign of my passage. A few agonizing minutes later, the footsteps receded. The hum faded into the general background noise of the building. I waited, counting to 100, then to 200, my muscles screaming from the tension. The air in the shaft was thick, stale. Finally, I decided it was clear. Carefully, I pushed the service door open again, just a crack. The corridor was empty. I slipped out, moving with a newfound urgency. My immediate goal was the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. That was where the truth was waiting, undeniable and stark. The route there was a labyrinth of service tunnels and storage rooms. I moved like a phantom, my forensic training kicking in, every sense alert. I noticed the scuff marks on the linoleum, the faint chemical scent lingering in the air, the distant clang of metal on metal. These weren't just details, they were potential indicators, a silent narrative of the building's hidden life. I used them to guide me, avoiding areas that showed recent signs of activity, sticking to the forgotten paths. Finally, I reached the familiar, stark white corridor leading to the restricted area, something final. The door to the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was still closed, thankfully not tampered with since my last visit. I retrieved the carefully hidden keycard, my fingers trembling slightly. I slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The room was exactly as I'd left it, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. This was my battlefield, and my weapons were precision and observation. I went straight to the specimen containers I'd prepared, the ones containing the microscopic fibers and the unusual particulate matter. My earlier analysis had been quick, frantic, driven by a growing sense of unease. Now, I needed to be absolutely certain to build an unassailable case. I took out my portable microscope, connecting it to my tablet. The screen glowed, displaying the intricate weave of the synthetic fibers. They were not common. The material, a rare polymer, was primarily used in high-grade industrial filtration systems, the kind found in advanced manufacturing facilities, or perhaps clandestine operations requiring absolute air purity. Why would this be on the deceased? Then there was the particulate matter. Under magnification, they resolved into tiny, crystalline structures. Not dust, not grime. I ran a quick spectral analysis using a handheld device I'd brought. The results flashed on the screen, trace amounts of an obscure heavy metal alloy. It was a component, a very specific one, used in advanced electronics, particularly those designed for signal jamming or data wiping. This wasn't just a murder. This was a targeted elimination, executed by individuals with access to highly specialized equipment and materials. The weight that doesn't add up moments I'd felt earlier coalesced into an undeniable truth. This was professional, this was planned, and it was covered up meticulously, almost perfectly. Almost. I worked methodically, taking high-resolution images, recording precise measurements, documenting every single detail. My hands moved with practiced efficiency, but my mind raced. I needed to get this out. Not just to the police, who were clearly compromised, but to the public. The stakes were too high. This wasn't just about one life. It was about the integrity of the entire system. My gaze fell upon the deceased once more. The official report would state blunt force trauma, perhaps a simple fall. But I knew better. I looked at the subtle bruising patterns, the slight discoloration around the neck that suggested something more than a casual impact. I pulled back the sheet just enough to re-examine the neck area. Yes, faint, almost imperceptible ligature marks. Someone had tried to make it look like an accident, but they hadn't been thorough enough, or perhaps they hadn't expected someone like me to look so closely. I documented the ligature marks, the exact depth, the width, the angle. This was the final piece of the puzzle, confirming my suspicions. The individual had been incapacitated, then staged. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I had the truth. Now I just needed to tell it, but how? My phone was a tracking device, my every communication potentially monitored. A public forum, a journalist, someone beyond their reach. The city was a maze, but somewhere within it there had to be an honest voice, a beacon. I had to find it. And I had to do it before they realized I was still breathing. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a percussive accompaniment to the low hum that now vibrated through the very air, not just the floor beneath my worn boots. It was no longer distant. It was here, a mechanical growl that seemed to emanate from the thick, reinforced door directly ahead. The air in this forgotten corridor felt heavy, stale, carrying the faint metallic tang I'd come to associate with things best left undisturbed. I pushed the heavy door. It groaned, a sound like an old beast waking, and swung inward to reveal a space that chilled me to the bone. This was the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested area. Not the sterile, well-lit spaces I was used to, but a more utilitarian section, tucked away, almost an afterthought. The walls were unpainted concrete. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered with an unnerving irregularity, casting long, dancing shadows. In the center, a stainless steel table gleamed under the harsh light, eerily pristine, and around that table they waited. The lead investigator, his face a mask of practiced skepticism, stood with his arms crossed. Beside him, a figure I only knew as the district liaison, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, maintained a placid but unreadable expression. Further back, near a stacked cart of gleaming instruments, a technician fiddled with a projection screen, his movements stiff. The air crackled with a silent, simmering hostility directed squarely at me. User Who, the lead investigator's voice was flat, devoid of its usual booming authority. I insisted on this. Emergency session. Said I had something urgent. We're all very busy people. I ignored the implied threat, the dismissive tone. My hands, surprisingly steady, clutched the worn leather brief I'd brought. Every piece of evidence, every painstaking hour, every sleepless night was contained within. I walked to the head of the stainless steel table, placing my brief carefully, almost reverently, on its surface. The cold metal seeped through the leather, a stark reminder of the gravity of the situation. I stated, my voice perhaps a little too quiet but firm. I have proof that the initial findings in the case of the deceased were incomplete, misleading even. The district liaison raised an eyebrow, a slight shift in her otherwise impassive face. Misleading, User Who? That's a strong accusation. The preliminary report was clear. It was too clear, I countered, looking directly at the lead investigator. It painted a picture that was convenient, almost too perfect. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it. The moment I doubted myself, replayed every calculation, every microscopic observation, every fiber analysis. What if I was wrong? What if my own determination had blinded me? But no. The data was there. The truth was there. The official cause of death was attributed to a single deep stab wound to the torso, inflicted with a specific type of blade, consistent with the weapon found at the scene. I began, my gaze sweeping across their faces. The timeline, the blood spatter, the entry wound trajectory, it all pointed to a struggle, a fatal blow, and a quick demise. I nodded to the technician, who clicked a remote, bringing up the first slide. It was a macro photograph of the deceased's torso, focusing on the primary wound. This wound, as I can see, is precise, clean, and according to the initial examination, it was the fatal injury. And it was, the lead investigator interjected, his voice edged with impatience. What exactly are I suggesting, User Who? I'm suggesting we looked at the obvious and stopped there, I said, picking up a smaller, sealed evidence bag from my brief. Inside was a fragment, barely larger than my thumbnail. During my re-examination of the deceased's clothing, particularly the inner lining of the jacket, I found this. I held it up. A shard of what appears to be high-grade ceramic, embedded deep, not merely caught. The district liaison leaned forward slightly, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The lead investigator frowned. Ceramic? What does that have to do with a knife wound? Everything, I replied, my voice gaining strength. The initial examination missed it because it required a level of microscopic scrutiny that wasn't performed. This fragment wasn't from the environment. It was from the deceased. More specifically, from an internal injury that occurred before the stab wound. I gestured to the technician. The next slide appeared, an X-ray image. My finger traced a faint, almost imperceptible hairline fracture in one of the deceased's ribs, directly beneath where the ceramic shard would have been. This fracture, I explained, was not caused by the stab wound. The angle, the nature of the break, the complete lack of tissue disruption around it that would accompany a knife's passage, it's inconsistent. This fracture indicates blunt force trauma, significant blunt force trauma. A murmur rippled through the small group. The technician glanced at me, then at the lead investigator, his expression unreadable. But the stab wound was fatal. The lead investigator insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. The amount of blood loss. The blood loss was significant, yes, I conceded, pulling out another evidence bag. This one contained a small vial of fluid. But what if the deceased was already incapacitated or even dead when that stab wound was inflicted? I paused, letting that sink in. Impossible, the lead investigator finally scoffed. The struggle, the defensive wounds, were consistent with an initial struggle, yes, I agreed. but not necessarily one that ended with the knife. My analysis of the blood spatter pattern, specifically the velocity and distribution of the cast-off droplets, suggests a different sequence of events. The initial impact, the blunt force trauma that caused the rib fracture, occurred at a lower velocity than the subsequent knife attack. And critically, the blood from the stab wound showed a slightly different coagulation pattern than the trace amounts found at the site of the blunt force impact. I clicked to the next slide, a complex diagram of blood spatter analysis. This indicates a time gap, a short one perhaps, but a gap nonetheless. The victim was hit, hard, incapacitatingly so, by an object containing this ceramic material. Then, after a brief period, the stab wound was delivered, not as the culmination of a fight, but as a final, deliberate act on an already compromised individual. The district liaison's eyes narrowed. An object containing ceramic, something that would break on impact, leaving behind a trace, something like a high-end, custom-made ceramic-bladed weapon designed for stealth, or perhaps a specialized tool. The kind of thing I wouldn't find lying around, and certainly not the kitchen knife we were led to believe was the murder weapon. I held up the vial, and this fluid, he was found in trace amounts deep within the deceased's nasal cavity. It's a powerful sedative, enough to render someone unconscious but not necessarily dead. My analysis shows it was administered shortly before the blunt force trauma, perhaps to subdue them for the initial attack. A collective gasp, subtle but palpable, went through the room. Lead investigator's face had gone pale. A sedative, Iris saying. This wasn't just a fight, it was an execution. I'm saying, I corrected, my voice ringing with clarity now, all doubt banished, that the story we were told, the one that pointed to an open and shut case, was a carefully constructed lie. The stab wound was a theatrical flourish designed to mislead. The true cause of death, or at least the initial incapacitation, points to something far more calculated, and the real weapon, the real method, has been meticulously hidden. What we need to find now is not who held the kitchen knife, who wielded the ceramic weapon, why they wanted us to believe a simpler, far less sinister narrative. The hum of the machinery in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested area seemed to intensify, a prelude to the storm I knew was about to break. I had laid out the truth, piece by painstaking piece. Now, the real hunt began. The hum of the machinery in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested area, didn't just intensify. It solidified into a dull, throbbing drone that resonated in my bones. I had laid out the truth, piece by painstaking piece, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights. Now, the silence that followed my final words was heavier than any roar. The detective, whose initial skepticism had slowly melted into grim realization over the last hour, was the first to move. He didn't speak, just leaned forward, resting his forearms on the gleaming steel table, his gaze fixed on the array of evidence I'd meticulously arranged. The microscopic fibers, the peculiar residue from the impact point, the subtle, almost imperceptible tool marks on the discarded weapon, all of it screamed a narrative utterly at odds with the official report. The original suspect, he finally said, his voice a low rumble, couldn't have done it this way. Not with this. He tapped a gloved finger near the magnified image of a unique polymer fragment I'd extracted. This isn't from anything we recovered at the first scene. No, I confirmed, my own voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands that I kept clasped behind my back. It's from a very specific type of industrial sealant, one used in large-scale construction, particularly in the city's recent waterfront development projects. And the angle of impact, combined with the fracture patterns on the victim's skull, indicates a different weapon entirely than the one initially presented. A heavier, blunter object, one that also bears traces of that same sealant. A colleague who had stood silently beside the detective let out a slow breath. So the first weapon was a plant, and the original suspect was framed. I nodded, the word framed hanging in the air like a death knell. My stomach churned, a mixture of vindication and profound unease. I had dismantled an entire case, exposed a lie so deeply woven into the fabric of what we thought we knew. The detective straightened, his eyes narrowing. And the why? Why go to such lengths? This was it, the precipice. I took a deep breath. The victim was about to blow the whistle on significant financial irregularities concerning the waterfront project. Embezzlement, kickbacks, falsified safety reports. They had compiled extensive documentation ready to go public. The detective's jaw tightened. And the prime suspect in the original case, the one we had in custody, their business was struggling. They had a known grudge against the victim, a public dispute, an easy target. Precisely, I answered. A perfect distraction. The real culprit, the one with everything to lose from the victim's revelations, needed a scapegoat, and they needed to make sure the evidence pointed unequivocally away from themselves. Who? The colleague asked, his voice barely a whisper. Who benefits from silencing the victim and from the success of that project? I met the detective's gaze. The construction magnate. I stated, the name feeling like a lead weight on my tongue. The principal owner of the development company, the one who spearheaded the entire waterfront revitalization. A gasp from the colleague. The detective simply closed his eyes for a moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The construction magnate, a pillar of the community, a celebrated philanthropist, a man whose name graced buildings and park benches. The idea of him orchestrating a murder and a sophisticated frame-up was almost unthinkable. Almost. The sealant, I continued, pressing on, needing to lay every last piece bare. It's unique to the batch ordered for the magnate's specific projects. I cross-referenced it with supply chains. And the victim's internal drives, which I managed to recover and restore, contained encrypted files detailing the magnate's financial shell corporations and illicit dealings. Files that were scheduled to be released publicly the day after the murder. The detective opened his eyes. They were hard, resolute. He's untouchable, he murmured, more to himself than to us. Politically connected, influential. Not anymore, I responded, a tremor finally making its way into my voice. I had pulled at a thread and unraveled a tapestry of corruption that went far beyond a single murder. This wasn't just about justice for one person. It was about exposing a rot that had festered at the highest levels. For a fleeting second, a wave of self-doubt washed over me. Had I truly done the right thing? Had I considered the repercussions, not just for the magnate, but for everyone involved, including myself? The sheer scale of what I'd unearthed, the power I'd challenged, felt suddenly overwhelming. What if I'd missed something? What if this powerful figure found a way to turn it all back on me? The thought was a chilling whisper in the back of my mind. But then I looked at the images of the victim, projected starkly on the screen, and the doubt vanished, replaced by a fierce resolve. This was the truth. It had to come out. The detective pulled out his communication device. "Get me the chief superintendent," he barked into it, his voice echoing in the confined space. "And dispatch a team to the magnate's residence. Secure everything. No one leaves, no one enters." The storm was breaking. The next few hours were a blur of intense activity. More officials arrived, their faces a mixture of shock and grim determination. My evidence was re-examined, confirmed, and then reconfirmed. The initial lead detective on the case, called in from home, looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and something akin to awe, his career now irrevocably altered by his oversight. By dawn, the news was spreading like wildfire. The magnate had been apprehended, protesting his innocence vehemently, but the weight of the forensic evidence, coupled with the recovered digital files, was crushing. The official narrative of the open and shut case had crumbled, replaced by a far more sinister truth. Later that morning, as the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested area was finally cleared, the detective approached me. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes held a newfound respect. "User who," he began, his voice softer now. "You did good, better than good, you blew this whole thing wide open." He paused, looking around the sterile room. "You know this changes things, right, for him, obviously, but for you too." I knew. The path I'd chosen, the truth I'd unearthed, had painted a target on my back. The magnate might be in custody, but his network, his influence, would not simply vanish overnight. I felt a profound weariness, the kind that seeped into my bones, but also a quiet sense of accomplishment. I had stared down a powerful lie and forced it into the light. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already had an idea. He gave a slight, wry smile. "It means you're no longer just the analyst in the lab. You're the one who saw what no one else did. The one who wasn't afraid to dig deeper, even when it put you in danger. It means your name will be whispered in certain circles, both in admiration and perhaps in warning." He was right. My status had changed. I was no longer unassuming. I was the one who had exposed a powerful, hidden truth. And while the immediate conflict was resolved, the emotional aftermath, the lingering tension of having made such a formidable enemy, settled deep within me.